All right. A couple of points to make right at the start about China. Every time I give a lesson on China, I start off with that the Chinese were the people who almost did what? Almost burst out from their domain and overspread the whole globe. These people were the most inventive, creative people on the face of the earth up to the year 1500. Among their inventions, they invented porcelain, widely used in electronics today. They invented steel, they invented silk, the wheelbarrow, the printing press, and that invention should have propelled them to the top of humanity right there. The gunpowder, the rudder, movable rudder, which is used on ships and airplanes, the movable sail, movable type, that's part of the printing press, paper money, the banking system. All this stuff that they invented should have put them at the top, but it didn't. And there have been many, many books written as to why. We'll visit China at least one more time before the end of the semester and have another talk about what was basically wrong with China. Well, for all the stuff that was right with it. Now, something else I want to say that, I get in my car after every lecture and on the way home I think, I didn't say this, I didn't say that, I wish I'd have said that. Okay, but here's what I'm talking about, dragons. The dragon is a big part of Chinese literature, Chinese folklore. And if you go to a Chinese restaurant, one of their 12 signs of zodiac is the dragon. Now, dragon stories are found, folk, all over the globe. And when you look at the pictures they drew of them, they have a remarkable resemblance to the bones we find of dinosaurs. Now, here's something that would be considered terrible by some certain groups. They point out how ignorant high school teachers were when 30% of high school teachers believed that men and dinosaurs encountered each other. And guess what? I believe that men and dinosaurs encountered each other. Some among those 30% of the ignorant. There, who knows it? Dinosaurs were the dragons. We have found dinosaur soft tissue, in other words, and inside the soft we found blood vessels with hemoglobin still inside them, indicating that these creatures lived only a few scores of years ago at the most. Now again, supposedly the last dinosaur died millions of years before the first humans came. That's the standard story. But the Chinese talk about them. And of course, I had one student do a paper on it and said that the fact that the descriptions are a little bit different in different parts of the world shows that those not real, that the stories aren't real. I have to say, Bill, guys, the fact is the stories are different in different parts of the world because they encountered different types of, different species of dinosaur or different species of dragon. Be that as it may, the dragon stories, again, a big part of Chinese folklore. And when we go to China, we find a lot of dinosaur bones, including dinosaur eggs. And some of them have young dinosaurs starting to grow inside them when we crack them open in the day, of course. Anyway. Now, what I'm about to say is something I've never said before, but the map here that I have is where the National Geographic is tracing how mankind started out and then spread over the globe. And the Chinese appear to have come from the Middle East, which is not surprising in view of, I believe, about world history. And a lot of them took a route from, some of them started here in the Middle East and took an overland. Some of them started through here, took a route through Saudi Arabia. Why does they say Saudi Arabia? In Saudi Arabia, there's a mountain called Mount Sinai. The Chinese, all right, let's see, starting with those. The word China comes from the word Sinai or Sinite. There's not much said about the Sinai's Bible. It's enough to give you some idea where they came from. Mount Sinai is where the Chinese went through on their way to China, and then they passed possibly through. And so it looks like in a lot of cases they took an ocean route, because we don't find any DNA from between here and here. Stopped in India along the way, and some of them stayed here, and then some of them moved on into what is like China. And also, this is something we did not know until 30 years ago, there are a lot of people of Caucasian descent in China also. We did not know that Caucasians ever went to China to live, but a lot of them did. All right. The Chinese believed that their civilization came from what they called the rule of three sovereigns. I'm not going to ask you to learn their names. These three sovereigns were three kings who ruled China one after the other in very ancient times. Now, they are not historic. So they're what's called legend. Now, folks, again, in studying history, you've got to know the difference between myth, tradition, legend, and finally, history. Myths usually involve gods. Traditions are stories that were handed down by word of mouth before somebody wrote them down. In our own American history, we had a case of the Vikings, that the Vikings came over to Greenland and then came to Nova Scotia. This story was handed down by word of mouth for generations, and finally someone wrote it down. But it was considered tradition, or because we don't have an original source to describe it. It was just the person who wrote it down many generations later. But anyway, that's stories handed down by word of mouth. Legend are stories that involve, they're like myths, except they involve heroes more than gods. The story of Hercules is considered a legend. Actually, Hercules is somewhat between a myth and a legend. And finally, you get true history. The story of the three sovereigns goes in the realm of tradition, and we don't have an original writing from that time that describes them. It's just the Chinese had long believed that they existed. We have not found their palace. We have not found any of their graves. But the Chinese claim that these people taught the Chinese how to farm, how to hunt, how to fish, and how to organize into governments. Basically taught them how to civilize, and told them that this person should take up this profession and that person take up that profession. Basically organized them. So the three sovereigns gave China the gifts of civilization and taught the Chinese how to write. Now, another thing in common that these civilizations had, they started out on the banks of rivers. In the case of China, they had two rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze. Yellow and now eventually they dug a canal to join these two together called the Grand Canal that joins these rivers together. The Grand Canal still exists. But you had in these two rivers. Now nearby here, there's a river called the Yellow River, but it's not the same as the Chinese Yellow River. The Yellow River right nearby here is just nothing more than a creek. The Yangtze River is a huge river that's capable of carrying large barges. And the same thing with the Yangtze River. Two rivers, one another, quite a ways apart. Also, China had a big desert. There was again, we're talking about isolated pockets of humanity. Right here, a big desert right here, and a big mountain range here, and then the ocean here separated China from the rest of humanity and allowed China to develop its own way. Now, unlike India, China was united during most of its existence. Now, not all. There were times when China was divided, but most of the time China was they had a tendency to unite. Now, look at Chinese writing, I mean, of course, I'm no expert on Chinese writing, but it reminds me a little bit of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And something else about Chinese history that reminds me of Egyptian history. Both of them, China and Egypt. And again, if you look on the map that I'm showing you, it appears that some of the Chinese passed through Egypt on the way to China. But their dynasties, their history was based around their dynasties. But unlike Egypt, where the dynasties were known as the first dynasty, second dynasty, third dynasty, fourth dynasty, the Chinese named their dynasties. There was the Han dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and so on and so forth. One dynasty after another. Now, there have been historians recently who have stated that the Chinese dynasties would fall when the climate cooled. Climate change. All right. Now I'll get into something I did not mention earlier. What causes the climate to cool down? The sun cools. Every 300 to 350 years, we had a possible cooling of the sun. In the 1300s, it led to the Black Death that killed millions of people. Then in the late 1600s, we experienced a little ice age that killed millions of people also. And we know, because we've not invented a telescope to discover the sun, we know that the little ice age was caused by cooling down of the sun. It's possible then that these other ice ages and cooling down periods were caused by the same thing that happens somehow every 300 years. The reason I bring it up is we are due another one. And guess what? I mean, being a ham operator, very much aware of this, our sun is not producing sunspots at the rate that it normally does. We don't feel the effects of it yet. But given another few years, we could experience an ice age, in spite of what the global warming people will tell you. And I'm not the only one saying that. You look at the right, go to the right places on the web, you'll find other articles that say the same thing. Ice age. And then there was the ice ages, the people in China would blame their emperors, overthrow their emperor and start a new dynasty with a new emperor. And of course things would get better because the sun would move up. The emperor had to do it. Now, the Chinese civilization managed to survive until the year 1949. Yes, the year I was born, when the communists took over. But it's the only civilization of the past, the only one that survived intact all the way from its beginnings, from 3 sovereigns, down through one dynasty to another, until, some historians would say 1905, when the last emperor was overthrown, or some say 1949, when the communists took over. Basically, China underwent some drastic changes in the 20th century until they're not the same China that they were in years past. Of course, at one time we thought the Chinese history was unchanging and the Chinese culture, but now we know the Chinese culture did undergo changes from time to time throughout history. Now, the first dynasty that the Chinese admitted to was a Z dynasty. Don't worry about the name, I'm not going to write it down, ZIA. This dynasty is what we call prehistoric, or it's in the realm of tradition. We don't know if it actually exists or not. But the next dynasty after it, the Shang dynasty, is the first historical dynasty. What makes the Shang dynasty historical? We have discovered their palace, we've excavated their palace, we found the ruins, we found their graves, until we know that this dynasty actually existed. Now, what we have found is that these people would use turtle shells or shells of other animals to determine the will of the gods. They believed that the intestines of animals would change color depending on what the god's temperament was. And so they would open up the animals and try to determine the future by studying the entrails or the intestines of animals, just like other ancient peoples did. Or they would take turtle shells and notice the discoloration of turtle shells. They believe when the turtle shell has this color, that means this is going to happen. When the turtle shell, and there might be some truth to it, because if a big climate change is coming, some of these animals might change the color of their shells in preparation for a climate change. And we don't know now. If it's a cold day in February and you see a snake crawling on the ground on a cold day, that definitely portends there's an earthquake on the way. They can sense it before we do. They know the earthquake coming. They get out of the ground and come to the surface. They keep from being crushed by the earthquake. This is known to be documented. A lot of people will see a lot of snakes. They can be in the summertime, because snakes know at some level that if they're seen, they're probably going to be killed. So they stay out of sight. But then when they're about to be crushed by an earthquake, they don't care about whether humans see or not. They'll come up to the top. Again, so sometimes what the animal behavior, the American Indians could tell when the enemy was near when the blue jay started chirping angrily. The blue jay meant that the scolding blue jay meant that the blue jay was either scolding them, or if they were not in sight of the blue jay, that meant that the enemy was in sight of the blue jay, and therefore they'd better start getting ready because the blue jay could spot the enemy before they did. So animals do have a purpose in this, even though we in the modern world have lost our ability to determine what that purpose is. Now, these dynasties would appear for a time and then disappear, and I think, well, of course, this cooling climate might have had something to do with it, but oftentimes they would become corrupt from within. Corruption in government is a universal problem. There's something about when you get power and you just are tempted to get more power and you start cheating, taking taxes that you're not entitled to take, and eventually the people sense that, hey, you took more money from me than you were supposed to. They would, instead of turning the money over to the emperor, they'd put the money in their own pockets to enrich themselves. Corruption, the temptations to be corrupt is something that many, many people down through the ages have not been able to overcome. All right, now, the Chinese also had another concept about their dynasties, the concept of Tian. Don't worry about the word, but of heaven. In other words, heaven chose a dynasty. Now, the difference here between Chinese and the Western mindset. In the West, the gods were named, whether it be the god of the Jews, called God, or Zeus, or Thor, or Odin. The gods were, they had to be personal gods. The Chinese, their gods were very, very impersonal. In other words, they didn't even name it, just heaven. Heaven was a myriad of hosts. Lots and lots of gods who would get together and assemble, and they would discuss what they should do about the earth, and they would decide when a dynasty should end. They would decide when a person should die, when another person should be born. But it was very, very impersonal, the concept of heaven. Nameless myriad of many, many spirit beings that determined the fate of mankind. Now, one dynasty, though, that I do want to name, the Zhou dynasty, Z-H-O-U. This is about the third or fourth dynasty in Chinese history. They lasted about 900 years, the longest in the history of China. They taught their people, well, they developed a system of growing rice. Now, the Chinese, their number one crop has long been rice. The problem with growing rice is it takes teams of people, so this meant that rice was grown a lot of time by families. Now, what do I mean by family? Not just father and mother, that was part of it, but anyone who was descended from the same great-great-grandparents were considered part of the family, on the male line. So my great-great-grandfather's name was also John, and his wife Lucinda. So anyone who was descended from John and Lucinda would be part of my family, even though I've never met any of them except for my brothers and sisters, my dad and my grandfather. Cunningham family all scattered off. So I've never met one I'm related to other than my own immediate family. But anyway, if I lived in China, all of us be part from the great-great-grandparents of the same family, and we'd get up in the morning and work the rice field together. It was part of a community. It took a community to do it. If one family hardened the family in our sense. It took extended families, 5 generations to working together to grow the rice field. They began to develop what your book calls natural fertilizer. Now, folk, I'm going to be as nice about this as I can, but natural fertilizer simply means human excrement, human waste. It's the best fertilizer there is, but Westerners have never adapted themselves to use it, I guess for obvious reasons. It can spread parasites. Now, the Chinese did succumb at times to parasites, but they developed, they use these natural fertilizers to grow their crops. Again, rice requires a whole lot of labor. They eventually developed iron plows, and here's one of their other inventions that it took Europeans hundreds of years to copy. They put the harness on the horse's shoulder to where the horse could pull a bigger load than they could around the horse's neck, where the under the horse didn't choke to death. Europeans for generations were harnessing the horse around its neck, and they did not get as much work out of the horse they could have. They finally went ahead and put that harness on its shoulder, and hopefully all of you are going to go home to this class strapped to a shoulder harness. And horses would have the last laugh. They could see humans being strapped to a shoulder harness. And hopefully all of you will use yours on your way home today. I'll use mine, believe me, I always do. But anyway, leaving that, but the Chinese invented the shoulder harness. And it revolutionized Europe when Europeans finally got a hold of it, and it's believed that Europeans might have copied it from China. Also, the Chinese learned how to let land lie fallow. In other words, say they went to a 3-crop system. Now, the word fallow means you don't plant it for a year. This year they might plant rice over here, then plant some veggies here, and then let this land lie fallow. In other words, grow nothing. We now know that this put nutrients back in the soil. The next year they might let this land lie fallow, grow rice on this land, and grow veggies on this land. And it's called crop rotation. It took Europeans a long time to learn that crop rotation. Now today we don't need to practice crop rotation so much because we have fertilizers that we can put in the ground and put the minerals and nutrients back in the soil. But if you plant the same crops on the same soil year in and year out without putting nutrients back in, eventually you're going to find your crops sort of become depleted. Nothing grows anymore. But the Chinese learned how to let land lie fallow for a year. Now, the next dynasty after the Zhou was the Qin dynasty. Now again, that's spelled Q-I-N. The Qin dynasty, and folk, this is a hot issue right now. The Qin dynasty built the Great Wall of China. The purpose of the Great Wall was to keep their uncivilized Mongolian neighbors out. Now, if you think I'm being hard on Mongolians, the Romans built Hadrian's Wall to keep my own uncivilized Scottish ancestors out of England. So, there have been at least 3 times Offa built a wall to keep the uncivilized Welsh also out of England. So England has 2 walls, one built by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, the other built by Offa. But the walls were, now again, building a wall to keep certain people out of our country is a hot issue today, in America today. And you might ask, well, why was the wall necessary? I had a student do a paper one time. This was another college. He said that no, China would have saved money. What they really should have done was built a trained army. That's what they did. But folk, here's what happened. These uncivilized Mongols would sneak in the middle of the night when the Chinese did not have, night detection, did not have helicopters, did not have radios, did not have telephones. They would carry off everything they could, including slaves, people. And then they'd rush back across the border to Mongolia. By the time the army learned about it, it was too late. So the Chinese built a wall to keep the uncivilized, and folk, it was necessary. I mean, it really was, because these Mongols would come in, take your wives, children, whatever, and take you if they could, and then sneak back home. Well, the Chinese began to learn how to maybe bribe the Mongolians into releasing their captives back. But among other things they did was they built a wall to try to keep the uncivilized people out. Again, each of you can and probably already have and will make up your own mind what you think of it. In this period of time, whether it's the right thing to do, they did it. Now, the Qin dynasty, its first ruler, buried himself with some 6,000 terracotta figurines, life-size. And these terracotta figurines at one point found their way into Atlanta. We'll take the Civic Center. I was aware they were there. I did not go see them. I mean, I'm bad about not going to see them. They've had mummies there at the Civic Center, but they had terracotta figures that were built by the first Qin emperor. And supposedly these were the statues that they would accompany him to the next life. And again, like the Egyptians, the pharaohs of Egypt prepared for the next life, the Chinese emperors. And we do have people in America who sometimes will bury themselves with an automobile, thinking that somehow they're going to take that with them in the next life. The Chinese emperors did the same thing. They would bury themselves, and the Egyptians had buried themselves with their wealth, thinking that they would take their wealth with them to the next life. Forget the old saying, you can't take it with you. They would say, well, I'm going to take it with me anyway. Now, then after that came the next dynasty, the Han dynasty. That's the only ones I'm going to mention today. The Han dynasty we're going to talk about in chapter 5. The Han dynasty ruled from 200 BCE to 200 CE, in 400 years, 200 years before Christ, 200 years after Christ. And again, we're going to have more to say about them later. Just be aware that they were there. Well, they were some of the most inventive people around. They were the ones who invented the rudder. They invented the fore and aft rigging for sailing vessels. In other words, all right, about the sailing vessels. If the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way, how do you do it? Anybody know if you're in a sailing vessel now?
Go diagonal.
What's that?
You have to go diagonal.
Yeah, it's very, very good. You go diagonally. You put your boat going at an angle, put your sail here to catch the wind at an angle, and you zig and you zag. And every time you zag, you move your sail to catch the wind, you go at an angle. It can be done, but the wind blowing against you, it's slow, but you can move against the wind, but you're going at an angle. But again, you have to be able to move your sails. And the Chinese invented movable sails. You have to have a rudder, of course, movable rudders. Again, these people, there are persons who believe that the early Chinese mapped the whole world, went all over the world. And of course, we do know that they went to California before Columbus, but keep in mind, the trip from China to California is 10,000 miles. The trip from Europe to the New World is only 4,000 miles. So it was quite an undertaking for them to cross the Pacific Ocean. They went and they quit. Again, that's part of the story of Chinese history. They would start to take off on the direction of technology, high tech, but they quit. But they make a start. All right, moving from there, very, very important topic now, their religion. Originally, I've already mentioned they believed in Shangdi. He was the one, and they were still worshiping Shangdi. Every year they'd celebrate. The emperors would go to a certain place where the considered holy as Shangdi. The last time this ceremony was done, folks, was in 1935 when Chiang Kai-shek did it. Then Chiang Kai-shek was unable to do it because he first had to fight the communists under Mao. Then he had to fight the Japanese. Then he had to fight Mao again, and then he lost. And the communists took over, and they said there is no God. So they threw out all religion. But Shangdi was still honored as recently as 1935. They believed that Shangdi was the original God. That he was, but eventually, though, they replaced him with a myriad of heavenly hosts. So they believed that heaven was the the symbol of universal order. Heaven, not any one God in heaven, but heaven itself, the hosts kept order. Now, here's another interesting part of their belief. Belief in the yin and the yang. Another name for the yin was sun, or the yang was sun, yin was moon,